Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Normally, at this point, um, I say to people, if I'm in a room full of physical people, I say, "Can anyone name that photograph?" Because it's the most reproduced photograph ever, and it's called the Blue Marble, and it was taken from Apollo 17 on about the 7th of December, 1972. And when they brought it back to Earth, when they beamed it back to Earth, they kind of worked out three things. One is this planet is very, very beautiful. The second is this planet looks very, very fragile and is. And the third is that 78% of the planet is water. And it's rather strange that we call it planet Earth rather than planet water. Um, and so what I'm going to talk about this evening is a walk I did around the watery margin of this island. Um, and if you look at Britain, um, not many people know, but not because we who live here don't call it an archipelago, but it is, and I'll come on to that. But it's about the 14th largest island in the world. But because we have this enormous tidal range, most of anyone else in the world, apart from one place in Canada, we actually have the biggest intertidal area of any country on Earth, any island on Earth, including Australia. And that matters because it's that daily churn of the tide that makes our coast so rich in nature and in birds and invertebrates and fish and all that. And it was kind of that I was interested in. And the other thing is that being an island, we are massively influenced by the sea, in particular by two things. One is that the weather comes in from the west, but even more important is this 60-mile wide wall of water that comes over called the Gulf Stream. And what that does is it keeps our island temperature our sort of climate very moderate because we're on the same latitude as Moscow and Montreal, but we don't get those very, very cold winters. And oddly enough, there's a kind of 20 or 30% chance that one of the effects of climate change will be that the melting ice from the Arctic pushes that Gulf Stream further south, and that we will inadvertently get much, much colder winters. We don't know. Um, the coast that I decided to walk around was 11,000 miles. I didn't walk the whole thing. I did walk 2 years before from the Solent up to Cape Wrath the whole way, but I hadn't got the time to do 11,000 miles. So I walked about 2,500 miles of it over the course of 2023, 24. And what I was trying to do was to see what was going on the coast and try and work out why we seem to have fallen out of love with it, um, and what the issues were and who's trying to sort them. And the first thing you come across is that this is an archipelago of 4,600 islands, of which about, I think, 158 are inhabited. That's a lot of islands. That's one of the most archipelagos in the world. Um, and you could actually, if you reduced your minimum size for an island, make that about 6,000. And obviously, the majority of them are up on the northwest coast of Scotland, but there are islands everywhere. And one of the things I found very curious is when I set off, I was only intending to go to about 3 or 4 islands, but I ended up going to 29 or 30, and I became almost obsessed with them. And I'll come back a little bit and say why. But the first thing that struck me is we call this a coastline. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, line means two things. It means very straight, well, have a look at it, and it means permanent. And that, again, if this was a live audience, I would say, well, anyone know where that is? And the answer is on the east coast of Yorkshire. And that is the fastest eroding piece of coast in Europe. And out there are in and around there are about 32 villages. And yes, you get the old man in the pub who says, on a calm day, you can hear the church bells. But we talk about this kind of fragility of our coast as if it's fragility. This is not. This has been going on for 8,500 years since the last ice age, um, and about 2 meters a year. So we're now about 17 kilometers in, and it will go on for another 10 kilometers until it hits solid rock somewhere in the middle of the Yorkshire Wolds, when it will stop. Um, and this should come as a surprise to no one, but still actually does to the East Yorkshire District Council um, in some of their planning applications. But we have a very mobile coast, a very dynamic coast. And one of the things that really thrills me was got a coast of enormous change. And I don't know if any of you have walked from, gone on some of the coasts of Northern Europe, Germany, Holland, Belgium, Denmark. But it's basically just one thing, it's sand and dunes. And here we are, and we have this extraordinary variety. So this is Cape Wrath, where I started. Wrath, I should say, is not wrath as in anger, but wrath as in turning point. So this is where the Norse ships would turn down south, right down the west coast of Britain. And that's looking east to Dunnet Head, which is the not John O'Groats is not the northernmost point of Britain, and it's ghastly. Dunnet Head is, and it's beautiful. So here you've got these kind of 150, 200 meter big basalt cliffs, and then further down south, this is more variety. This is Bempton in Yorkshire, and this is just north of the photo I showed you a couple of minutes ago. And this, believe it or not, is the last solid land until you reach Dover. So everything between Bempton in North Yorkshire and Dover is this alluvial flow that came out from the glaciation in the Ice Age. And that is why East Anglia and Lincolnshire, that is the breadbasket of the country. That's why the soil is so rich and flat, but also extremely erosive. Here's another type of environment. This is a big estuary. In this case, this is Lindisfarne, or rather, that's Lindisfarne in the distance. And most people who go to Lindisfarne drive over the causeway over on the left. Actually, by far the best way of doing it if you're mobile is to take your boots off and walk. This is one of this is the Pilgrim's approach, and it's about 3.5 miles. And you need to get your tide tables right. But you really get the feeling of this island looming up on you, and you see the nature going on around you. Then another bit of variety. This was Cornwall, these kind of broken cliffs and rocks. And then another, and this always surprises people, London, one of the main coastal cities of the world. And London has a beach. In fact, London has many beaches. And if you were brought up in London and you're of an age, you may well have gone mudlarking, and the licenses are still issued. And I love this because I actually walked from out in sort of East Kent all the way into London and all the way up to Kew Bridge and then out into Essex on the other side. And every city or town I went to, I tried to find a local to walk with me for half a day to explain their town. And this was my youngest son's girlfriend, who is a Bermondsey Cockney. And this was wonderful. We were walking along the King Charles III path, Thames path. And then suddenly she ducked down this alleyway and said, I want to show you my favourite beach. And it was so out of context. And she said, this is where we take our dog when he wants beach time. And I just thought that was rather lovely, in the middle, looking over at Canary Wharf. And there's a dog having beach time. And then the last bit of variety I'm going to show you is Maplin Sands. Now this is off the Essex coast between Essex and Kent. And I don't know whether any of you have done this, but there is a footpath that goes 6 miles through the sea to the island of Foulness, where you've got deep water on both sides of you. And you know, it's killed 150 people over the years, so you need to probably take a guide. But before the bridge was built in the 1940s, this was the only way you could get to Falmouth Island. Um, and a it's a really good way, again, get your feet wet and feel this kind of liminal thing between you're not wet and you're not dry, you're a bit of both. And I think that's a wonderful way of experiencing our coast. Uh, we forget, obviously, that it's a human coast. There are 27,000 species of animal and insect in the UK, and we are one of them. We nature writers often forget that. We're just unceasingly rude about our own species. I try not to be. Uh, um, Here is an old tin mine in Cornwall. There was a huge amount of a huge percentage of the country's employment was based on the coast in things like mining and fishing and trading. And of course, a lot of it's gone. And that was the second or third big discovery of this walk, which is so much of our coast has gone, so much of this sort of humanity in our coast has gone. And the the expression I heard most often when I went around these coastal towns was used to, not is or will be, but used to. And you could kind of see it in the half these towns had their piers, and the piers were, a lot of them were derelict and decrepit. And I sort of spent a lot of the walk trying to find out why the coast had declined from the kind of heydays in the 1920s and 1930s. And I think there are various reasons, but a really important one is the beaching acts in the late 1950s, early 1960s fell cruelly onto the branch lines that led down to a lot of these coastal resorts. And it happened just before the advent of cheap flights that took people to more reliable sunshine in Spain and Portugal and Italy and France. Um, and that kind of brought to a shuddering halt this idea of the 2 week boarding house holiday. And I remember all the time I was going around the coast and I was staying in bed and breakfasts, which are kind of the next thing to boarding houses. And they were saying no one comes for 2 weeks anymore. No one even comes for 1 week. They'll come for a stag weekend or a couple of nights. And that's altered the entire economy of the coast. But the really scary thing is that I can absolutely promise you there is a train crash coming. And the train crash is this, that more and more old people are going to the coast because it's healthy, as it should be. Health outcomes should be 3 or 4% better on the coast than on an equivalent inland town. And they're getting older and iller. And at the same time, the number of carers to care for them is getting less and less. And that really worries me. And the trouble is we have governments that go, oh, we really care about this, and then do nothing. And this government is no different, and the last one was no different. It's going to be a big problem. And I started seeing it in some of these sort of deprived places I went to, and it was quite scary. One of the things we've forgotten is that up until quite recently, it was a coast of great danger. There are 37,500 registered shipwrecks around the coast, probably the same again, unregistered. This one, which I took the photograph from this footpath, from the Broomway, which gives you an idea. And I can talk about this and be rude about it because no one was hurt or drowned. This was a captain in April 1982 who had drunk too much and just drove it onto a sandbank. But what has happened is that still about 250 people drown a year in the seas around this country. But the coast has gone from being this place of kind of peril or danger to being somewhere that we feel we've controlled and is safe. And I think that matters. We'll come on to that. And one of the punctuation marks of my journey was the 238 lifeboat stations, which are situated around the country. And I put this slide in because I think that the significance of the RNLI is that not so much that they save people, we know that. I think they save about 500 lives a year, but they kind of give us permission to enjoy the sea more than we would if they weren't there, whether we're sailing or dinghy racing or paddle boarding or just swimming. Um, they are magnificent. And I say in the book, I really hope people will um, continue to support them because it is just about entirely run by volunteers. So I went round anti-clockwise, and that meant that the sound of the seagulls was always in my right ear, and the sound of the surf was in my right ear. Um, and I thought, and I did about 12 or 13 100, 150-mile walks. And each one I focused on just one thing. So up here, which is I walked from Cape Wrath down to Ullapool and then went across to Lewis and walked down through the Outer Isles. And I was over a kind of 2 week period. And I was just really interested in salmon farming. Now, salmon farming, I haven't eaten farmed salmon for about 7 years. And I wanted to test my logic and see whether I was being fair or right. And what I was trying to do is look at both sides of an argument. So, on the side of salmon farming is the fact that it is a low carbon, highly nutritious, very small footprint food. It creates maybe 3,000 well paid permanent jobs in isolated communities where there aren't many. Certainly, in my knowledge, it keeps a number of little primary schools open, which otherwise wouldn't be. But if you ask me now, I still don't eat farm salmon because I think the price that is paid, the environmental price and the welfare price is too high. And the environmental price begins on the seabed below, and it continues with the antibiotic use, which of course doesn't stay within the net, but can go as far as 10 miles downstream. The sea lice, the salmon are tormented by sea lice. This summer I went, so this photograph was taken in 2023. This particular farm, which is one of the better ones, had 28% pre-harvest mortality. Now, if you saw 1 in every 3 cattle dead in a field, something would be done. But out here, a mile and a half from the shore and out of sight, there's not such an imperative. Now, it's an industry that is trying to improve, but I think there's a real problem. And the problem is that we convince ourselves that cheap food is cheap food and that price stops at the till. And my experience of sort of 8 or 9 years of doing this is cheap food, generally the price starts at the till, both in sort of health outcomes and in the price of the environment. Interestingly, it took me 6 months before I did this walk to persuade the salmon industry to let me on a farm. And eventually I rang up the chief executive of Salmon UK, Salmon Scotland, which is the body that runs the trade. And I said, you're going to come out looking really, really bad. And to be fair to them, they then enabled me to go on this farm. But I think the biggest, almost the biggest issue of all is this fella. This is a wild Atlantic salmon. And they get affected because salmon escape from the farms. They pass sea lice that these guys can't deal with. And it's just another of about 19 or 20 problems that wild salmon has that it doesn't have to have. And in December 2023, so just after I'd done this walk, the wild Atlantic salmon was put on the red list by the IUCN, which is a kind of extinction watch. And just think about that for a moment. That is a fish that was 150 years ago so common you were forbidden from serving it to your servants more than twice in a week, is now so rare that some of the farms that I was going past had more farmed salmon in one farm than there are wild Atlantic salmon left. And so, but that gives you an idea of how I would sort of look at a subject, pick it up. So the second subject was seabirds. I'm so excited by this that the next book I'm working on is on this fellow, the white-tailed seagull. With that huge coastline, we've got a very big responsibility to the world for seabirds, far more than most other countries. And by and large, I think we discharge it quite well. We've forgotten the awful days of the 1970s with single-skinned oil tankers crashing all the time and leaking oil everywhere. Now, mercifully, touch wood, those are more or less things of the past. There are other issues, obviously, but we don't do too bad a job. I was particularly interested in the white-tailed eagle and the Isle of Mull, because quite a lot of my upbringing was on the Isle of Mull, which in the 1960s and 70s was absolutely economically on its backside. And anyone who got to 18 just left the island. And of course, in 1985, this chap came back and created the kind of honeypot of tourism, where now there's 160 full-time jobs in tourism. It brings millions and millions of pounds of revenue to the island. And it's got there are problems. The traffic is terrible. The house prices are high, but those can be sorted. There is an intractable problem about the perception that they take sheep, lambs, and they will, but very, very rarely, because this is the ecology of this bird is as a kleptoparasite, which means most of its food is killed by someone else and stolen by the eagle. They will take a sick lamb, they will take an unattended lamb, but very few. And I think, in the book, I try and explore what can be done. But fundamentally, we have, after fantastic introduction effort, we've now got 200 pairs of these birds around the entire island. We have millions and millions of sheep. And I did end up asking myself the question, can there not be room for both? And I hope the answer to that is yes. Seabirds, like I say, we've got this big responsibility. We've got about, I think, 80% of the world's Manx shearwaters, about 50% of its northern gannets, about 50% of its great skuas. So huge responsibility. This is the Farne Islands with some black-footed kittiwakes, the razorbill out in the background, and some guillemots down there. And the biggest issue, of course, is bird flu, and which, there is evidence that the birds are getting some kind of immunity. But oddly enough, this is very linked to the salmon question, that the bird flu has been around for ever, rather like human flu. And generally, they just get it, shake it off. It's not an issue. This strain started in a Guangzhou goose farm, funny old thing, more industrial farming, and is much, much more virulent. And you need to know that it's starting to pass to mammals, sea lions in South America, cattle in the USA. So it's not beyond the wit of, not beyond thought that it could migrate to us. But I think it's just a sort of almost a testimony to how we live our lives, these sort of rushed, busy lives and all this industrially farmed food. We create problems for ourselves. Just a couple of other little examples of things I looked at. This is a good news story. This is Loch Craignish, a little bit south of Oban. And I was looking at the seabed. Now, the seabed is incredibly degraded by beam trawling and scallop dredging and power boats and whatever. But this guy and his community in Ardfern just decided about 15 years ago, we're not happy. We're not going to let this, we're not going to leave our loch destroyed. And they didn't wait for money and they didn't wait for permission. They just started replanting seagrass. So here's seagrass and reseeding native oysters. And the point about seagrass and native oysters is they're symbiotic in what they do for each other. And the great thing is that with the seagrass, they could children can get involved because it's a low tide activity, and now they are financially supported, and they employ 6 full-time people, and they've got a satellite thing up at Ullapool. So they're really making a difference. And everywhere I went, North Wales, West Wales, um, Essex, Scotland, and in the Solent, the biggest seascape project in Europe is going on in the Solent, right by our South Downs. There are really good people doing really good things. And again, because it's underwater, we don't see it, and we should be interested in it. Again, I'll just talk about plastic. This is on, these were Russian fishing boxes I found on a beach that must be about 30 miles from the nearest town up in the north of Scotland. And that an awful lot of the plastic I found was ghost plastic from fishing fleets, completely avoidable. There is a statistic, and I don't know if I believe it or not, that for every 100 meters of British coast, there's about 700 bits of plastic. And that's either far too high, if you're talking about big bits of plastic. I mean, I've walked 2,500 miles, I should know, or far too low if you're talking about microplastics. And as someone who is very, very keen on birds, I'm shocked at, I think 98% of all seabirds, when you look at their stomach, have microplastics inside. So plastic is a good invention, but we need to learn to get rid of it responsibly. But again, here's one of the reasons it was a good news story. This is in a town called Ravenglass in Cumbria. And here is a guy called David Shackleton, who his retirement present to himself was to spend 2 years doing a beach clean on one beach south of the town, and then putting the entire thing as an art installation in his front garden. And actually, this doesn't include the tractor tires and the other tires and all the big bits. And it makes a fantastic statement. And I sort of went to see him. And originally, when he started, people were going, "Oh gosh, you're spoiling our town." But now they're proud of it. And he gets a bit of publicity from my book. So he goes on the local radio station. And we are doing stuff. Here is St Michael's Mount, and behind it, Penzance. I don't know if any of you have come across this initiative called Plastic Free Towns, but the first one that got accreditation was Penzance. And I was a little bit cynical. I went to go and interview them, and I thought, well, the day before, I'm going to go into every shop in the town and ask for a plastic coffee cup or a plastic bag just to test it. And everywhere I went, they said, "Oh, no, you won't get that here." So they are walking the walk as well as talking the talk. And it can be done. And I was so impressed by the time I left with their commitment. And what they did is the opposite to what our government does, in that instead, they spent 2 years going around getting all the stakeholders they needed on site, the businesses, the schools, the churches, the sports clubs. And then only when they had done that did they launch it. And they launched it quietly, waited to see if it worked. And it's a brilliant initiative. And I think there are now something like 230 plastic-free towns. And if any of you are interested, you can look the details up, I think, on the Surface Against Sewage website, SAS website. And sewage was sadly the bit I had to cover in Hampshire and Southern Water. I'm not going to metaphorically or otherwise rub your noses in it. You know the story. And I believe it is getting better. I get challenged on that a lot, but I think there is so much pressure on these guys now, there has to be. But what I want to talk about is these guys. So that was Langston Harbour, as is this. And there were 25 different pressure groups about the sewage. So there were concerned mothers and kayakers and paddle boarders, yacht clubs, all of them getting nowhere. There's this kind of great British thing of, I'm so angry I could almost do something. And these two guys brought them together under one umbrella organisation, which you may have come across, called, I think, the Clean Harbours Partnership. They raised about 60 or 70,000 pounds. That enabled them to brief two academics who taught them how to test water. So in no way could Southern Water then say, well, you're wrong, because these guys test it better than Southern Water. And it's been a success. The issue with water, I would say, is not, particularly for us living in this area, is not so much it's not so much the sewage, that is awful, but the fact we're going to run out of water and no one's talking about it. And by 2055, it's assessed that we're going to have about 60% of the availability we've got now. And there's lots of reasons. But again, you need to know that the water companies have absolutely no statutory right to object to all these new towns and villages on the basis that they can't provide the water. And yet at the same time, the developers have the statutory right to be connected. Classic British environmental logic. This was maybe the darkest bit of the walk. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, 40 kilometres of crustacean die-off around the Tees estuary. And I cover it in some detail in the book, but it could have been one of 5 things, of which there was one in particular that the government really didn't want it to be, which was pyridine, which is a kind of industrial byproduct that dredged up and released from the sediment, because that would mean that the preparation for the new free port was causing a problem. Now, I'm not a scientist. Even now, having really researched it, I have my ideas, but I couldn't tell you for sure what it was. But what I can tell you is that the dissenting scientist was getting death threats within a couple of days of doing his report. A couple of the other activists who were involved were getting death threats. And we simply have to find a better way in this country of having our debates. I've had death threats and other things, and I'm a kind of boring nature writer, and you go, that really is not a good way of having our environmental debates, because we are always going to have disagreements, and that's fine. That's part of the fun of being a human. But as someone said, I think it was Karl Popper, that the point of argument is not victory, but progress. And I would love us to learn that, because it is really, really important. Just a couple of other snapshots. I walked along the North Norfolk coast, and I was going to write about one thing. And then I decided, no, I tell you what I'm going to write about is abundance. And this is 90,000, about 35 tons, 90,000 pink-feet geese flighting in on a December dawn from their tidal roosts onto the beet fields behind Hokum. And it is fantastically exciting. And although we moan and say we're the most denatured country on earth, we're not. We are denatured, but there is a lot going on that is good. And I think what we need to do, in order to make sure that our children don't just hear us being negative over and over and over again and say, well, there's no point in me doing anything because it's a goner. It's not a goner. One of the points I make at the end of the book is it is unbelievably cheap to restore nature in comparison to everything else that's been done. And we make this, our governments, particularly this one, and we all hoped it wouldn't be that, see nature as this kind of nice to have, that once you've done everything else, oh, maybe nature will be all right. It's not. It's absolutely vital. We do not know what happens when ecosystems collapse. And it's vital for our mental health and for our physical health. And I hope that we will, and I've been involved in a little bit in helping to campaign for the Natural History GCSE, which will now happen. I'll believe it when I see it, because we've denatured our schools, and we need to renature them very rapidly. The chapter on cetaceans in Cardigan Bay and this idea of um, are they disturbed? Are they over disturbed by tourism? I think on balance, not. But what we need to be aware of is that the seas around us are warming much quicker than the land, and that's pushing the food column. So the base of the food column is phytoplankton, followed by zooplankton, followed by krill, followed by the little fish, followed by the big ones. And it's all going north. Now, to a certain extent, that gets replaced by stuff coming up from the south. But actually, it's starting to mess up everything. And we need to keep an eye on those sea temperatures because they are going higher. This is quite cool. This is a Fairborn in Cardigan Bay. And you're going to hear about this a lot because this is the first village in the UK that is going to be evacuated because of sea level rise. Now, you're all sensible people, and so am I. You can say, what the hell were they doing building a village there in the first place? But when we say evacuated, that means all the utilities ripped up, everyone leaves. And over the other side of the country, they wouldn't let me on this, actually. They said we can't let people on because of the risk of terrorism. And I thought, well, there goes my 9 years in the army. But this is the most magnificent infrastructure project in a country that's losing its confidence on infrastructure projects, and let's not even go to HS2. This was built in reaction to the terrible floods of January the 31st, 1953, when 4,000 people were killed in the North Sea. And it was brilliantly conceived, and they worked out what the sea level rise was going to be, and they worked out there'd be an increase in storm surges, and they just said, get on with it. And they said it'll last you till 2030, and it won't. It was so well built, it will last till 2070. And I like to think that we can sort of get back into that mindset. But that's London. You would protect London, wouldn't you? Because it's got trillions of pounds of property and businesses and everything else behind it. Will you also protect Gloucester? Will you protect Peterborough? Will you protect Glasgow? I don't know, but we need to start thinking about it. And there's just on the erosion. This is further up the coast in Yorkshire. I love this because these were obviously unsaleable and uninsurable. So the local students were occupying them until they fell off the cliff, and then they'd sort of move to the next one until the council said, well, you're going to have to pay for it when it falls off. So that's a sort of very, very quick whiz around some of the things I was doing. What do I think at the end? And I think the first thing is from the human, I was much more optimistic for nature than I was for humans. And that's not happened with me before. I think there's a lot of people looking after nature on the coast and doing great things, but they're not looking after humans. And what all these coastal communities need is well-paid, full-time jobs, mainly for young people, but for others as well. And everything else will follow if they can create that. And it shouldn't be beyond the wit of man because we have the internet, we have working from home, and these places are absolutely gorgeous. Otherwise, what we're going to get is this, where there's more and more deprivation, and Morecambe, and this is Blackpool and Wythenshawe and Bognor or Hastings or wherever. These are towns that were once wonderful, have still got a beating heart that can make them wonderful, but they need an imaginative government. There's a tautology for you to go, actually, this could solve a few problems. And here we are building 1.5 million houses. The number of empty houses I saw when I was going around the coast, which could be full. And also when you then go to a beautiful place like St Ives, where sort of 60% or something of 50% of the houses are second homes, that strikes me as a sort of a missed opportunity and an unfairness. So that's one of the things. The coast is full of these opportunities for leisure. Here is surfing in Cornwall, and but so many people, so many kids have never, from inland have never actually been there. They've seen this on pictures, but we need to get them there so that they can see how wonderful it is. Art. This is Anthony Gormley's Another Place. Um, it's quite extraordinary. You know, do 100 body casts of yourself and shove them on a beach in Crosby. But it's very powerful. If you've not seen it, it's only about 20 minutes off the M6. Really worth a thing. There's so much art knocking around. Um, and I wasn't. I'm married to an artist, but I'm not. No, I wasn't expecting to find it as I did. And it, I think the coast has always brought out brought out the artists in people. This is just this is Jet, Whitby Jet, and this is my little cry for localism. So Whitby Jet is basically fossilized monkey puzzle tree, and Whitby when Queen Victoria was widowed and told everyone to be miserable for 10 years. Whitby went, ka-ching, this is wonderful. We could sell lots of our jet. And then after Queen Victoria died, everyone said, oh, we can be happy again. And so the jet industry died down until some bright spark realized that Bram Stoker had written Dracula in Whitby. And so now it is the center of Goths. And so these shops are all going again. What we need is lots of localism, lots of local solutions. Like this is just a little story of a ship in 1997. 60 containers were knocked off by a freak wave on a ship just west of the Scillies, and one of them had sea-themed Lego, 5 million pieces of it. And there's now this entire subculture around the southwest coast of this sort of hierarchy of the bits you want, and about 3 bits, like a black shark and a green dragon, that no one's ever got. And everywhere I went, you'd see these people with their heads down walking along the coast to try and find them. And if you're interested, look up Radio 4 Lego. There's a wonderful documentary on it. Islands, islands are known as thin places. This is why I kept going back to islands, because they're where the gap between the physical and the sort of metaphysical world is at its thinnest. And you don't need to be religious, and I'm not. But I got this fabulous feeling. This is Bardsea up on the top end of the Llyn Peninsula, looking down at Cardigan Bay. And I could have, every time I went past an island after that, I would just hop onto it for a day, and sometimes do no more than just sit on top of the cliff and watch the birds and be happy. And then there's just pleasure. When I walked up the country 4 years ago, I measured my progress out in flat whites, and I had 92 of them. When I walked around the coast, I measured it out in mint choc chip, and I think I had 72 of them as I went around. But the coast is and should be a joyful place. And I hope what I hope for the book is that it's hopeful and positive. It recognizes the people who are doing brilliant things, and there are many of them. But it also says to everyone else, don't ignore this place. You know, we've got 11,000 fabulous miles of coastline. We are so privileged. We just need to rediscover our inner islander. And I finish with this. This is the northernmost man on mainland Britain, and it had been me about 10 minutes before. And this coastline, so this is the last day of my journey. And when I get to the end of a journey, and it's quite reflective, there's sort of almost a bit of grief. And I was sitting eating my cheese and pickle sandwich, and this bloke was behind me, looking like I was on his personal bar stool. And eventually I said, are you okay? And he said, yeah, when you're done. And there's 40 miles of coast on either side, but he had to be on that particular piece. So this is my revenge picture, that one day he will come to one of my talks and he will be there, and I will explain that he's wearing a disruptive pattern material. I'm being a soldier, I know these were designed to say you wouldn't be seen in trees. There is not a tree within 20 miles of that place, and it made me so happy. And that's that. That shameless plug. That was the book that came out in June. Happy to say it's done well. You know, non-fiction is a difficult genre, but I hope that it does its bit to um, reconnect people with their coast. That's what I'd like to do. Um, Thank you so much for listening, and hopefully I'm more or less in time. Really happy to take questions, and I shall stop sharing now.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. Yes, if anybody does have any questions, if you could put them in the chat room, and I'll put them to Roger directly. I do have one of my own actually. Having walked all that way around the UK, how did you change personally, do you think, from the start to finish?
Um, it's a good question. It's a strange answer, which is I became angrier and more hopeful. And I sort of developed this idea that if you remember your Venn diagram from school, and you have a circle of anger and a circle called hope, and on their own they're useless, but if you push them together, that bit in the middle is activism. And so what it kind of it made me more of an activist, but also it opened my eyes to beauty in strange places, like Redcar Beach with the old um, British steelworks behind, is stunningly beautiful. London, walking through the sleeping city at dawn, is staggeringly beautiful. And that was so. I think, as I say, it made me angrier, more hopeful, but much more in touch with the privilege of this band of coast that surrounds my island.
Thank you. Got a couple of questions here. One from Michael G. He's asked you to defend your comment that the sewage situation is getting better.
All right. I probably phrase that. I think this because it is so much in the public eye. You have to remember this has been going on for 40 years out of the public eye. It is now in it. It is much, much more difficult um, for these releases to happen without us knowing. And the infrastructure is being mended. It's a scandal that it's been 40 years. And the reason it's in trouble is when it was privatized in 1983, the government cancelled all the debt and said, what you have to do is use that money that you won't be spending on paying back the debt on rebuilding the infrastructure. Well, they didn't. They took it and they gave it as dividends and shipped it mostly offshore to where we can never see it again. But I think I've gone and interviewed Southern Water on a couple of occasions, and I'm actually quite surprised by their commitment to getting this better. And also the fact they are building a huge new reservoir. They are building more storm drains and things. Um, and one of the issues is no one, when you talk to them, no one is prepared, no politician is prepared to tell us, for example, to use less water. Or if there's a storm going on outside, don't flush the loo. If we all did that, that would be a help. But I think that I'm very conscious of, I don't think Southern Water or any of the water companies are going to get better at the rate we need them to get better if we waste a huge amount of energy in pillorying them. I'm amazed that no executive, no, uh, when you those two idiots who cut down the sycamore trees and the sycamore tree and Sycamore Gap, they got 4 years for cutting down a tree, and no executive from any water company spent one night in jail. That tells you something about the justice system in this country, I'm afraid. But equally, I believe, with the possible exception of Thames Water, they are on it. And I think we need to work with them as well as against them.
Okay. Juliet Merrifield has asked, did you look at the Sussex coast as part of your book? And what's your assessment of good news, bad news here for nature and humans?
Uh, yeah, great question. And I did. I sort of basically walked from Southampton to just the other side of Brighton, um, over a week. I think my impression is I'm it's incredibly built up. Houses have been built where they shouldn't have been. But I'm incredibly proud of the Solent Seascape project, um, because again, it's out of sight, but it's mending a lot of the seabed off the shore. Um, the I think the issue is more about communities than nature. I think in places like Pagham Harbour, the nature is very well served. Um, but the what worries me, like as I said when I was concluding the talk, is I just don't think we're looking after the humans. Um, I did my best moment or worst moment, depending on how you looked at it, was walking in towards Littlehampton through the dunes just off the golf course and not realizing this was a nudist place. And then suddenly arriving with a man fully on, standing, saying, "Where are you going?" And I was going, "Well, actually, I'm walking along with my backpack and I didn't know you guys were here. But at the same time, I'm not going back. So I'll just shut my eyes and go forward." Um, but I guess they were experiencing the joys of the coast. But it was a cold day and I took my hat off to them.
Right. Well, unless there's any more questions, I'll wrap up. So thank you very much, Roger. That was really fascinating. I've recently finished reading your book, but to hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, really brought it to life. So I'm sure I speak on everybody's behalf. Thank you very much for talking to us this evening. And if anybody wants to buy your book, I would recommend it. They can also go to your website, rogermorgangrenville.com.
I can.
So thank you. Are you still on board, Eloise?